Welcome to Conversations on the Coast, the Bay Area's premier author interview program. And do we have a program for you today? We are going to be talking about a book that's been needed for a long time. It is called Harold E. Stassen, The Life and Perennial Candidacy of the Progressive Republican. And it is by Alec, Kirby, David, Dalin, and John F. Rothmann. The publisher is McFarland and Company, which is in Virginia?
In North Carolina.
North Carolina. Now, when I read all of that off, all those authors, I wrote down, what a group. And how? How did you all get together?
The reason we got together is because of Harold Stassen.
Yeah.
I first became interested in Stassen because I love defeated candidates for president. It's my hobby. In 1964, I was 15.
You, excuse me,
Yes.
love defeated candidates?
Defeated candidates for president because nobody cares about them.
How do you feel about the ones that win?
They're not nearly as interesting, and you can't get to know them as well.
Right,
And
right.
here's the point. When I was 15 years old, the date was February 29th, 1964, I read in the San Francisco Examiner, which was then a morning paper, that Harold Stassen was going to be testifying at the California Republican Assembly meeting at the Airport Hilton. Well, 15-year-old kid, I picked up the phone. I said to the operator at the Hilton, connect me to Governor Stassen, please. And they put me right through, and Stassen picked up the phone. And,
That's an amazing story.
and once
right there.
once I identified who I was, he said, well, John, come on down. Now, remember, 15, I couldn't drive. I got on a bus, went down to the Airport Hilton, came in, spent the day with him. We had a marvelous time together. And that relationship continued when the convention of the party took place here in 1964. He invited me to sit with him on 2 nights. We had Claire Booth Luce on one side, Margaret Chase Smith on the other, and frankly, I thought I had died and gone to political heaven. Through the years,
And that's how you became a conservative Republican.
no, I'm a liberal Democrat.
Oh, sure.
But I am. The answer is I've always identified myself as a liberal. I was a liberal Republican. But as George Will once observed, the problem with being a liberal Republican is it's a little bit like being a high church Unitarian. It's possible, but pointless. Governor Stassen and I kept in touch. He, of course, as we'll describe later, had his bouts with Richard Nixon. I worked for President Nixon in Wisconsin in 1968, saw Governor Stassen there. We had a wonderful chat. And even though he didn't like Nixon, he was thrilled that I was working on a presidential campaign.
That's one of the nicest lines in the whole book, that he was thrilled that you were working on a campaign, which in a way, to me, says more than a lot of other stuff in the book, that he would feel that way, even though he and Nixon were far, far apart.
He was a wonderful man. And of course, when he came out here to San Francisco, he'd been a founding delegate at the conference that created the United Nations. He was one of the primary authors of the charter, as I hope we'll get to. I had the pleasure of being with Governor Stassen and his wife at the 40th anniversary. But the bottom line is that when he died, I interviewed his son Glenn on KGO, and I'd read in my research that David Frost, in an interview with Stassen in 1968, had asked him, what do you want your epitaph to be? And Stassen said, he laid the foundation for a lasting peace. And Glenn said, John, that's it. That's what we're going to put on Dad's tombstone. And so, to me, it was full circle, from his being nice to me when I was 15, encouraging me, helping me, to my being able to help decide what would be on his tombstone, and more than that, to be able to write this book. It's a remarkable story about a remarkable man.
And it's got a lot of stuff in it that nobody has ever heard of. I mean, you trace and show and prove the incredible energy that this man had.
31 years old, elected governor of Minnesota, the youngest governor in the history of the United States. In 1939, he was chosen to speak to the Gridiron Club in Washington opposite Franklin Roosevelt. All the leading newspaper people of the time, all men in those days, by the way. Stassen performed so brilliantly that night that Roosevelt took note of him. And when the founding conference of the United Nations was about to take place and a delegation from the United States had to be selected, he put this Republican former governor on the delegation. It's an amazing story. And, of course, Stassen helped lead the Republican Party away from isolationism and into internationalism. He helped Willkie win the nomination in 1940, earning the enmity of both Bob Taft and Tom Dewey, who forever, and they stopped him really from becoming president.
Yes.
But Stassen went to work in World War II for Bull Halsey. He was on his staff in the Pacific, witnessed the surrender of the Japanese. At the San Francisco conference, founding the United Nations, Stassen was acclaimed as one of 2 delegates who made a real difference in the conference. And the amazing thing was, this young man really is the author of the Charter of the United Nations, did a phenomenal job, and then made the decision when he came back to civilian life and after that conference to run for president, which he did in 1948, the first person to try to use the primaries to win a presidential nomination. And he came, Jim, so close, but of course he lost.
All of that you've just related shows that this guy had organizing ability like, I don't know, few politicians in the history of the country.
First grassroots campaign for president. He organized the Paul Revere Brigade, if you will. His people who went into the critical primary states, particularly Wisconsin and Nebraska, into Ohio to battle Bob Taft, and then into Oregon, where he lost to Tom Dewey. First time 2 candidates for president debated on the same stage in American political history. Remarkable story, and maybe we'll get to it later.
We certainly may. Harold E. Stassen, this book really gives us, as you already know, a superb close-up of one of the most important politicians in our country's history. We'll continue to look when we return.
You're listening to Conversations on the Coast with Jim Foster. Follow us on Twitter at JimFosterCoc or send an email to jimfostercoc@gmail.com.
The great John F. Rothmann is our guest today. He is a co-author of a book called Harold E. Stassen, The Life and Perennial Candidacy of the Progressive Republican. And there ain't many of them.
It's true. It's a complete oxymoron in a way. The fellow who wrote the foreword to this book is Lewis Gould, one of the foremost historians in the United States, presidential historian. And Lou writes that Harold Stassen would not have a home in the Republican Party. The Republican Party wouldn't recognize him today. Because
I was thinking when I was reading that somewhere in there you guys say that when Stassen left or was gone, there was a hole in the Republican Party, if you will. And I was thinking, unfortunately, that hole got filled by the Tea Party.
Yeah, but there was no moderate wing of the Republican Party left. Stassen was a relic of another time. When you think about 1948, had Stassen won the nomination, and he debated Tom Dewey on the subject, resolved the Communist Party should be abolished in the United States. He took the affirmative. Dewey took the negative. Dewey defeated him in that debate. Had Stassen won the Oregon primary, he would have been the Republican nominee for president. And I think the whole history of the Republican Party would have been different. But he lost. He went on to become president of the University of Pennsylvania at the same time that Dwight Eisenhower was president of Columbia. They formed a relationship. Stassen, by the way, was a great president of the University of Pennsylvania. In 1952, he wanted to run for president again. He ended up running, but as he said, in part for Eisenhower, to stop Bob Taft and the conservatives from taking the party before Eisenhower came back from Europe. In the end, it was the votes of Minnesota that put Eisenhower over the top in a very close Republican convention. Stassen went on to serve in the Eisenhower administration, but the most significant aspect of this is Stassen hated war, and he hated the idea that we might blow ourselves up with a nuclear weapon. He became disarmament advisor to the president. He was known as Secretary of Peace. And John Foster Dulles, who was Secretary of State, said, well, what does that make me? Secretary of War? And when Stassen came...
The answer to that question is yes.
When Stassen came within a hair's breadth of getting a treaty in 1957 with the Soviet Union, Dulles, really, I think out of maliciousness, pulled the rug out from under Stassen, destroying Stassen's credibility and destroying his chances to be president. There is another element here in Richard Nixon, and I want to just throw this in now. Stassen is the man who discovered Richard Nixon in the South Pacific in 1944. He said to Nixon, you ought to run for something. Nixon came back in 46, ran for Congress with Stassen's support, although Stassen didn't remember meeting Nixon in the South Pacific. Nixon remembered Stassen. In 1948, Nixon supported Stassen for president. In 1950, Stassen supported Nixon for the U.S. Senate. In 1951, Stassen came to Nixon and said, you know, Dick, if you support me for president and you can deliver the California delegation, you can be vice president of the United States. The first time Nixon was talked about as a vice presidential nominee. As it turned out, Nixon is nominated with Eisenhower. And during the great Checkers crisis, the fund speech of 1952, Stassen stabs Nixon in the back, in Nixon's mind, by telling Nixon he ought to resign from the ticket. Nixon never forgot it, never forgave it. And then Stassen had another experience. He wanted to be Assistant Secretary of State, and Nixon stopped that from going forward, got the job to go to Herbert Hoover Jr. So the two of them now had an antagonism. But Stassen realized something else. Sitting across the cabinet table from Nixon twice a week, he came to feel that Richard Nixon was the most dishonest man he had ever met in American politics. And he determined in 1956 to dump him from the Eisenhower ticket. The question, and you'll have to buy the book to find out the answer, did Eisenhower engineer that move? In the end, of course, Stassen failed, and he left the Eisenhower administration in 1957, made a very poor political decision. Having been president of the University of Pennsylvania, he decided to run for governor of Pennsylvania. Everybody told him not to do it. He did it. He was defeated in the primary by a pretzel manufacturer.
Well, that's not good.
No, I'm sure
that's demeaning.
I'm sure it tied him up completely. In 1959, he ran for mayor of Philadelphia, was defeated by Richardson Dilworth, and then really begins the perennial quest. He ran in 1964, 1968, 1976, 1980, 1984, 1988, and 1992. He ran 10 times for the Republican nomination, and a phrase was coined, Stassenization, meaning that one continues to run and never has a chance. But Stassen was a man with great dignity, and there was a beautiful piece written on him in 1964 about New Hampshire, where he absolutely bombed. And the title of the article in Life magazine was, "A Dignified Loser Drops One More." Stassen really felt that his life was a success. One other thing that I wanted to throw in, he was the president of the American Baptist Convention.
Yeah, that really surprised me.
Deeply religious man, but what you may not know and what listeners won't know is that Martin Luther King Jr. so admired Harold Stassen and his stand on civil rights that he joined the American Baptist Convention. And in one of the most touching stories in this book, Stassen came in 1963, just as an ordinary American, to march with King in Washington. And he turned around, on one side of him, not knowing they were coming, he saw his son, and on the other side he saw his daughter. And Stassen once said to me, "I knew as a parent I had succeeded when we three were united at that moment, in that place, without knowing that we were going to be there."
In my opinion, that's the most beautiful story in the book. There are a lot of other stories, and if you're smart enough to stay tuned, you'll hear some of them.
You're listening to Conversations on the Coast with Jim Foster. Follow us on Twitter at JimFosterCoc, or send an email to jimfostercoc@gmail.com.
Yes, that is I, and across from me is a man who reads more books than I do. His name is John F. Rothmann. He's only one of the authors of the book Harold E. Stassen, Life and Perennial Candidacy of the Progressive Republican. Two other gentlemen, Alec Kirby and David Dalin. Is that how he pronounces it?
That's correct. And let me say, Alec Kirby wrote his doctoral thesis on Stassen about 25 years ago.
Oh, he's the one.
He
that's
did
mentioned.
A brilliant job. And I called him and I said, "Alec, nothing had been published. Would you co-author with us?" And he was thrilled. And Dave Dalin is an old friend. He and I co-authored the book Icon of Evil, Hitler's Mufti and the Rise of Radical Islam. And he had also always been interested. So the three of us got together. We all really worked together. And you can see the book flows very well. Somebody said to me, "How can three people write a book that flows so evenly?" And I think the answer is because we all love the subject and we all are sort of similar in our quirky interest in defeated candidates for president.
You're not taking responsibility for being the leader of the group.
I am
telling them what and when.
No, I am simply, I would say that my role was to really organize it, get it going. But all of us carried the weight equally, and we were thrilled when Lewis Gould, one of the leading American political historians, agreed to write the foreword to the book, which was really thrilling.
Yeah.
But these are great guys, and it was a pleasure working with them.
James Worthen, the author of The Young Nixon and His Rivals, says this about the book. This long overdue study explains how his intelligence and ability were overshadowed by an outsized ego that left no room for introspection. And if one looks back on the Dewey debate, one can say, oh, yeah, it's right there, isn't it?
That's exactly right. Harold Stassen was a brilliant, dynamic, forceful individual with wonderful ideas, but there was an arrogance about him, an arrogance born of the fact, we believe, that everything came to him so easily. He believed that he was going to be president of the United States. He believed he ought to be president of the United States. And it was something he could not adjust to when it didn't happen. I asked him once why he continued to run, and he said, it gives me a chance to have a forum, to express my ideas, to have them heard. But I think Stassen, deep down, believed sincerely that if he had been president of the United States, the course of history would have been different.
Well, I'm sure it would have been. I mean, we would have had a progressive Republican as president,
This is a guy who believed in the United Nations, who was absolutely committed to civil rights. We would have had a civil rights bill much earlier than 1964. This is a man who was a friend of labor long before Republicans embraced any kind of labor position. And, of course, they ultimately rejected any labor position.
Not only that, he fought the Taft-Hartley.
He did.
From within the Republican Party. That's an amazing thing. That thing was so wonderful to Republicans that...
That's what made Stassen so unique. And I believe that it's a fair statement to say that had Stassen succeeded in 1948, he would have changed the way we perceive things. The Republican Party would have become the great liberal party, and Stassen defined himself as a liberal. But let me point out, too, there were rivalries. When he turned his back on Dewey and Taft in 1940 and supported Willkie, they swore he'd never get anywhere in the party. The same thing happened with Stassen in 48. He went into Ohio to campaign against Bob Taft. That was the end of him. He was a man who simply had perfect faith in the fact that he was right. Howard Baker, the senator from Tennessee, Everett Dirksen's son-in-law, once observed, the problem with Harold is that somebody told him he would be president of the United States one day, and he believed them.
The other thing about him is that, he burned these bridges, with Taft and so on, but he didn't stop. He said, since I have burned these bridges, it seems to me he said this to himself, I'll find another way to go, another way to do it. That's exactly, he went out and he created another way to do it.
That's right. Well, what you pointed out earlier, a very, very interesting comment and absolutely true. Stassen, when he sought the presidency in 48 as a serious candidate, built his own machine. He did everything from outside of the party. And interestingly enough, when he decided to run for governor of Pennsylvania in 58, with no real political base there, and everybody told him not to do it, he said, listen, I know that I can do this. All people have to do is hear what I have to say. It'll be fine. He ran a hard race, and he flopped.
Yeah.
It's the arrogance of power, but you must understand, and everybody has to know this, when I met him in 1964, he was 56 years old. He had already been to the mountaintop. He'd already had greatness, and now he was deeply diminished. But he took time to sit with a 15-year-old kid, talk to him, nurture him, encourage him. I have never forgotten the tremendous kindness of Harold Stassen. Not only a brilliant political force in his own way, a man who ultimately failed, but if you ask me, the most winning of winning lives.
And also in that approach, in my opinion, lies greatness.
You're right.
Not so much in the victories.
One of the things he said later on was, he said, I tried to save the country from Richard Nixon. He was a man who was willing to battle the odds, nobody thought Nixon could be dumped in 56. And the section of the book that deals with the dump Nixon movement really is an important section. But Stassen, nonetheless, said, this is something I have to do. And his son Glenn believes to this day that that's what ultimately destroyed Stassen's political career.
Would you say that the writing of the UN Charter is his greatest, or at least one of his greatest accomplishments?
Stassen said that the greatest moment of his life was working for the UN, and he did that his whole life. He believed in the United Nations. He once said that he knew the failures of the UN, but the great success was that since World War II, there had never been a World War III.
Yeah.
And he credited that to the UN. And I would remind you today, with all its failings, the United Nations continues to be a forum where the world comes. It's a different world because of the UN.
And there are also many good things that the UN does.
World Health Organization, UNICEF, UNESCO. There are so many things that are amazing. And Stassen was one of the key founders. This is the guy who helped hold the conference together, defined the charter. And when he came here for the 40th anniversary.
And at this point, he's a kid,
right,
just out of the Navy.
Mm-hmm. His last major accomplishment was to write a book on charter revision, which came out in the 1990s. I include that in the book with his 10 key points. This is an important book. It establishes Harold Stassen, and may I tell you, it was a pleasure to write it, and even more fun to be here with you, Jim.
This is a book that you can buy very easily by going to an excellent local bookstore called Book Passage.
Both Marin and San Francisco.
Both stores. There you go. And if you're too lazy to do that, there's always Amazon.
Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and of course, if you go online, you can order directly from the publisher, McFarland. Jim, thank you so much.
Harold E. Stassen, The Life and Perennial Candidacy of the Progressive Republican, by Alec, Kirby, David Dalin, and John F. Rothmann. This has been Conversations on the Coast, and I'm Jim Foster.
Follow us on Twitter at Jim Foster COC, or send an email to jimfostercoc@gmail.com.